All right, so you send us some pretty in-depth material on Canadian firearms safety. Two official handbooks, actually, from the safety courses themselves. And we were talking the CFSC and the CRFSC, right?
Yeah, those are the ones. If you want to own a firearm in Canada, you got to know this stuff inside and out.
So we're going to get you up to speed on more than just, the rules and regs.
Yeah,
This is about making a real difference when you're actually out there using a firearm.
absolutely. These handbooks are
Uh,
the foundation for responsible firearm ownership in Canada. They're not kidding around.
Now, I'm guessing you're already pretty familiar with firearm safety, but these handbooks can be pretty dense. What's the most surprising thing you think someone who already knows about firearms might learn from these?
Hmm, that's a good question. Even someone who's been handling firearms for years might be surprised by how deep they go on the Canadian Firearms Program,
Mm-hmm.
the CFP.
Right.
It's not just about, don't do this, don't do that.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the why behind the rules and how it all fits together.
Okay, so you're saying it's more than just knowing you need a license.
Exactly.
It's about seeing the bigger picture of how the CFP is actually making sure that everyone across the entire country is handling firearms responsibly.
Exactly.
Cool. Okay. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of those laws, let's talk about firearm evolution for a second. The handbooks actually take us all the way back to cannons. Have you ever shot a cannon?
Uh, I can't say I have.
Right.
But what's really interesting is that these early firearms, which were pretty basic, almost comically rudimentary, they actually laid the groundwork for the safety practices we still use today.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Think about it with a cannon. You have time to really think about every step.
Yeah, you can't really rush it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But now, with semi-automatics, things happen so fast
Oh, yeah.
that you absolutely have to have those ingrained safety habits.
So you're saying that even though the technology has changed so much,
Mhm.
that need for caution is still rooted in those very first firearms.
Exactly.
That's a really good point. Now, these handbooks make it very clear that Canadian law around firearms is serious business. Like, they're not messing around.
No, they're not.
So break it down for us. What are the different levels of law that we need to be aware of?
Okay, so think of it like a pyramid. At the bottom, you've got the Firearms Act and the Criminal Code. Those are the federal laws that apply everywhere in Canada.
Okay, that makes sense.
But then, each province and territory can also add their own regulations on top of that.
So even if you're following all the federal rules perfectly, you could still get in trouble depending on where you are in Canada.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to do your research before you even touch a firearm.
Yeah, especially if you're traveling with firearms.
Exactly. The handbooks even use the example of blaze orange clothing. It might be required by one province but not another, even if it's not a federal rule.
Wow, that seems tricky.
It is. And don't forget about municipal laws.
Oh, right.
Some cities and towns have their own rules on top of everything else.
All right, so knowing your location is super important. But once we are clear on the law, these handbooks really drill in the Vital 4 ACTS.
Yeah, the ACTS.
Are they really as important as they say they are?
Absolutely. They are the cornerstone of safe firearm handling in Canada.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Have you ever heard a story about a firearm accident where someone said, "But I thought the gun was unloaded"?
Yeah, unfortunately I have. It seems like that's how so many tragedies happen.
Exactly. And that's exactly what the Vital 4 ACTS are designed to prevent. The very first one is assume every firearm is loaded. And that's all about fighting complacency. You treat every firearm as if it's ready to fire, even if you just checked it yourself.
So it's about creating this mental habit that overrides any assumptions.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the second ACT?
Control the muzzle direction at all times. That means you're laser focused on where that barrel is pointing every single second, especially when you're moving around, like when you're hunting.
Right, that makes sense. And I bet the third ACT ties right into that.
You got it. Keep your trigger finger off the trigger and outside the trigger guard until you're ready to shoot.
Right.
That's all about preventing that split-second reflex from becoming a disaster. Until you've made the conscious decision to fire, your finger stays away from that trigger.
All right, so we're assuming it's loaded, controlling the muzzle, and keeping our finger off the trigger. That leaves the fourth ACT. And I know this one is a big one.
See that the firearm is unloaded and prove it safe. This is where a lot of people, even experienced people, can get a little complacent. It's not enough to just think it's empty.
Right.
The handbooks lay out a very specific process for proving it safe.
Okay, so walk us through it. What are the steps that someone absolutely has to take?
All right, so first, you point the firearm in the safest available direction. Then you physically remove all ammunition. Then you visually inspect the chamber to confirm that it's empty. And I mean, really look.
Okay, so far so good. I can see how each step is building on the one before it, leaving no room for error.
Exactly. Then you make sure the feeding path is clear. That's where the ammo travels from the magazine to the chamber.
Okay.
And finally, you check the bore, the inside of the barrel, for any obstructions. Only then can you say you've proven it safe.
Wow, it's a lot more involved than just glancing at the firearm.
It is.
But I'm starting to see how these Vital 4 ACTS all work together as a system to prevent accidents.
Exactly. They're all connected.
What stands out to you about them?
Well, what I think is really clever is that they go beyond just being rules. They actually help you develop a mindset of safety.
Okay.
By following them diligently, you're training your brain to be hyper-aware of the firearm
Interesting.
and of its potential danger.
It's like they're building a safety net right into your habits.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about a specific type of firearm that's covered extensively in the restricted course. Muzzle loaders.
Oh, yeah, muzzle loaders.
Why do you think they spend so much time on what seems like such an old technology?
Well, it's easy to think of them as relics of the past.
Mm.
But in Canada, owning a muzzle loader still requires a restricted PAL. And they get a lot of attention in the course because the things that make them seem simple can also make them more prone to user error if you're not careful.
Okay, like what?
Well, loading a muzzle loader is a lot more hands-on than loading a modern firearm.
Right.
You're measuring black powder, packing projectiles,
Yeah.
using a ramrod, all things that require precise knowledge and attention to detail.
It's definitely not as simple as just popping in a cartridge.
Nope.
And speaking of black powder, I noticed the handbooks get into all the different types. Why are there so many variations?
It all comes down to the granulation of the powder. You've got FG, FFG, FFFG, FFFFFG.
Wow.
Basically, the finer the powder, the faster it burns. And using the wrong type for your specific muzzleloader can be dangerous.
Okay, so it can affect more than just its performance?
Exactly.
It can actually be a safety issue.
Exactly.
So even though it's an older technology, there's still a lot to learn about using a muzzle loader safely. It's not just about aiming and firing.
You got it. And this actually ties into a broader point the handbooks make about responsible firearm ownership in general.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued. What's the connection between muzzle loaders and the bigger picture?
Well, it's about recognizing that, responsible firearm ownership, it's more than just knowing the rules. It's about developing a deep understanding of the tool you're handling
Okay.
and respecting its power.
So you're saying even with something like a muzzleloader, where the technology might seem less complex,
Right.
you still need that same level of respect and awareness.
Absolutely. These handbooks, they're full of little reminders that safe firearm ownership is an ongoing process. You're always learning, you're adapting, you're refining your skills.
So it's like a continuous improvement kind of thing. It's
Exactly.
always striving to be better, safer, more responsible.
Exactly. And that brings us to something that I think is really important, but often overlooked. When we talk about firearm safety,
Yalkes. What are we missing?
well, the handbooks do a fantastic job of laying out the legal requirements and the practical steps for handling firearms safely.
Right.
But they don't explicitly address the importance of personal judgment and decision-making.
So it's about more than just following the rules. It's about understanding why those rules exist
Exactly.
and using that knowledge to make good choices in real-world situations.
You got it. For example, the handbooks emphasize safe storage to prevent unauthorized access.
Right.
But they don't tell you where the safest place to store your firearms is in your home. That's where your own judgment comes in.
Makes sense.
You have to assess your own individual circumstances.
So they're giving you the tools and the knowledge,
Right.
but you have to apply that knowledge intelligently.
Exactly. Responsible firearm ownership is about more than just checking boxes and following procedures.
Okay.
It's about being a thinking, adaptable, and conscientious individual who understands the weight of the responsibility they carry.
So these handbooks are really just the beginning. They're setting the foundation for what should be a lifelong journey
Exactly.
of learning and growth as a firearm owner.
They are, and that journey is even more important now, considering how quickly firearm technology is changing.
That's a great point. Earlier, we talked about how firearm evolution has shaped our safety practices. But looking ahead, what are some of the challenges you see as technology continues to advance?
Well, think about the rise of 3D printed firearms. How do our current laws and safety courses address something that can be made in a home workshop?
That's a really good point. What about smart guns? With fingerprint scanners and things like that, does that require a whole new approach to training?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the technology itself, it's about the potential for misuse
Right.
or unintended consequences.
As firearms become more technologically sophisticated, our understanding of how to use them safely has to evolve too.
Exactly.
So it's not just about keeping up with the latest gadgets, it's about really thinking about the implications of those gadgets.
Exactly. And that's where organizations like the CFP are so important.
Right.
They have to stay ahead of the curve
Right.
and make sure that our regulations and training materials are keeping pace with these changes.
It's a big responsibility. I mean, they're
Yes,
shaping the landscape of safe firearm ownership for generations to come.
they are.
And I think as responsible individuals, we all have a role to play too.
I completely agree. We can't just rely on the information we have today.
Right.
We need to be proactive, seek out new knowledge, engage in conversations like this one,
Okay.
and constantly try to improve our understanding of firearm safety.
It's a shared responsibility.
It is.
We're all in this together. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to go back to something you said earlier about the handbooks not explicitly addressing personal judgment.
Right. It's one of those things that's kind of woven throughout the material,
Sure.
but never directly stated.
Exactly. So for someone who's really taking these handbooks to heart, what's the most important takeaway when it comes to using good judgment?
That's a great question. I think the most crucial thing to remember is that safe firearm ownership is a state of mind.
Okay.
It's about being present in each moment, carefully assessing the situation, and making deliberate decisions that prioritize safety above all else.
So it's about being thoughtful and intentional in every interaction with a firearm.
You got it. It's about recognizing that you, as the firearm owner,
Yeah.
are the ultimate safeguard.
That's powerful. Yeah, it really emphasizes that personal responsibility.
It does, and that's what makes these handbooks so valuable. They're not just about memorizing a bunch of rules to pass a test.
Right.
They're about really instilling that deep sense of responsibility that stays with you even after you close the book.
It's like they're setting you up for a lifetime of safe and ethical firearm ownership.
Exactly, and that's something we should all be striving for, whether you're brand new to firearms or you've been handling them for years.
Well said. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the history of firearms to Canadian law, and the importance of personal judgment.
We've gone from cannons to cartridges, from the Vital 4 ACTS to muzzle loaders.
Haha, it's been quite a journey.
It has.
And for me, I think the biggest takeaway is that responsible firearm ownership is a continuous process. You're always learning and adapting
Absolutely.
and reflecting on your own practices.
It's not a destination, it's a journey.
Exactly.
And as technology keeps evolving, that journey is only going to get more complex.
That's true.
But I'm confident that if we keep safety and responsibility at the forefront, we can handle whatever challenges come our way.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into Canadian firearms safety.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and I hope our listeners got a lot out of this conversation.
Me too, and hopefully we've given them the knowledge and motivation to continue their own journey of responsible firearm ownership.
And remember, this is a journey we're all on together. By working together, supporting each other,
Yeah.
and always putting safety first, we can create a culture of responsible firearm use for generations to come.
Well said. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay responsible.